This is On the Record, where we take you behind the headlines and get to grips with the issues and the people that are shaping our world. I'm James Reinl. This is the Voice of Russia in London. It's no longer Afghanistan, Iraq or Pakistan. The new front line for the battle against terrorists is now in Africa. At least that's according to a new report from the Royal United Services Institute. In her document, Global Jihad Sustained Through Africa, Valentina Soria urges counter-terrorism chiefs to look south. Three groups of key concern are Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Al-Shabbab in Somalia, and the Nigerian group Boko Haram. The global terror network of Al-Qaeda, while in decline, could be forging worrying ties with these national groups. Valentina, it's been more than a decade now since the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington. So perhaps you could just give us an indication of how serious a threat the organisation is now.
Well, the organization core as it existed before 9/11, so obviously has been greatly degraded in its capabilities by very successful counter-terrorism operations, especially carried out during the last year. So obviously the elimination of Bin Laden in the first place, but also other key operational figures within the core organization has brought about a reorganization of the group itself. And so we now have a much weakened Al-Qaeda core, but obviously we are now observing a surge of terrorist activities by more localized groups which are loosely affiliated to Al-Qaeda and its ideology of global jihad.
And this is where we turn to Africa, because we understand that there are three groups of particular concern that you've been looking at. Let's take the first one, Al-Shabaab, the Somali militant group. I mean, are they turning towards closer links with Al-Qaeda because they're essentially being defeated on the battlefield by the involvement of US drone attacks and Kenyan forces coming in from the south and African Union forces retaking Mogadishu?
The alignment of Al-Shabaab to Al-Qaeda has been gradual, if you wish. They try to establish close links with Al-Qaeda core since 2007. Obviously, the official alliance between the two groups have been declared just this year by al-Zawahiri. The reason for this, obviously, it is at the same time this shows, if you want, that Al-Qaeda core is a much weakened organization, and now this is the reason why it needs to be associated with other causes, if you want, to remain relevant for some reason. At the same time, from Al-Shabaab side, obviously the link with Al-Qaeda core provides all sorts of advantages in terms of valuable connections, operational connections, strategic connections, but also for raising its profile among militant jihadist circles.
One of the groups that's become increasingly active over the past few months is Boko Haram in Nigeria, of course. They've launched a number of attacks recently, but you're presenting them as being associated with Al-Qaeda increasingly. But aren't they very much like a nationalist group?
Of course, I think that Boko Haram, we need to make a distinction here, whereas Al-Shabaab has gone more international in recent months. Boko Haram is still very much focused on its localized agenda, local agenda. It's still a locally focused insurgency group in the first place. What I refer to in my report in terms of connections with Al-Qaeda is been the ability of Boko Haram to carry out more sophisticated attacks. And so there's been a willingness from Boko Haram, the organization in Nigeria, to align themselves tactically, if you want, to Al-Qaeda core, so to espouse the Al-Qaeda model of operational and tactical expertise. This is why we see an alignment and a proximity between these groups, but not in terms of direct strategic connections between the two. And so you're absolutely right. Boko Haram still remains a locally focused group, an insurgency group, which doesn't necessarily is interested in becoming an international terrorist organization in the first place. But definitely in the way it is carrying out and it is fighting its campaign against the local government is going much more in the direction of Al-Qaeda.
It's a few times that you've used this phrase, Al-Qaeda core. Maybe you could just give us a colourful portrait of what this group is, who are these core people, and what are the kind of relations that you think they're having with Al-Shabbab and Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb? What does it come down to on the ground?
Well, Al-Qaeda core, with the term Al-Qaeda core, we refer to the central organization as it existed, as I said, before 9/11, if you want. So it comprised Bin Laden and al-Zawahiri and all sorts of operational and strategic commanders who were, as I said, the real core of Al-Qaeda in terms of training, in terms of tactical and technical expertise, in terms of command and control, and so on. As I said, successful counter-terrorist operations have degraded this core organization, and which is now mainly comprised of a very few individuals still there. In terms of the connection with these groups, they are not necessarily direct connections. As I said, Al-Qaeda has been able to establish operational connections with the aim of transferring to these groups tactical skills and expertise through its proxies. For example, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has been instrumental to establishing links with Al-Shabbab, for example, and also Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which of the three is the more aligned to Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda model.
But the way that you describe it is as if it's a kind of a top-down military organization. And isn't some of the things that we've learned about Al-Qaeda recently, for example, the fact that Osama bin Laden wasn't necessarily in control of operations from the villa that he was living in Abbottabad those past several years, doesn't it indicate that it isn't that kind of military organization?
There isn't anymore. The way the terrorist threat has evolved, the jihadist terrorist threat has evolved, exactly indicates this. We've gone from a centralized organization, a structure, with Al-Qaeda core in Afghanistan and Pakistan, directly leading, if you want, and also plotting attacks against the West and in the US and so on. So giving some kind of direct control to these organizations and groups, to a structure, much more loose structure of Al-Qaeda affiliates, which still espouse to some extent, embrace the loose version of the global caliphate model that Al-Qaeda obviously tries to establish, but are still concentrated and focused, or are still committed to their local causes, and obviously they have significance and strategic significance within the context they operate.
So isn't there a mismatch between what the two kinds of organisations want? If you've got the international Al-Qaeda model and its attempts to stop Western domination over the Arabian Peninsula through the Saudi royal family, for example, if that was one of their key goals, isn't that a very different goal to, for example, what Boko Haram want or what Al-Shabaab want? And what are the two parties getting out of any kind of arrangement?
What it's really interesting, it's really to observe this tension which exists between the transnational aims of Al-Qaeda core and the more localized agenda that these groups pursue. So the decision to become, if you want, a more international terrorist group, as the Al-Qaeda model would suggest, is not necessarily a direct one. And as you correctly say, there is a tension between these transnational aims and the more localized agenda. And this has brought, over time, to important fractures, for example, within the leadership of these organizations. For example, AQIM, like it existed before, but also Al-Shabbab. So we have observed a sort of or growing tension within the leadership itself between elements who want to remain locally focused and want to commit and concentrate their resources and efforts to fight their local battle, and those who would rather embrace the more international agenda that Al-Qaeda tried to espouse and promote.
And which of those two forces do you think is becoming the most powerful?
It really depends on the organization that you consider. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, for example, has gone international, as it is similar the case with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is now much more willing to export its fight and actually has taken upon the fight against the West, as the Al-Qaeda model would suggest, would recommend to do. Whereas for a group like Al-Shabaab, and more importantly, not Boko Haram, it's important to point out that is still, as I said, defined as more a local insurgency group. Al-Shabaab, I think, reflects this tension very well. We have seen leaders within the organization who now try to promote a more international agenda. But at the same time, there are those who are much more committed to their local cause. And so there has been a significant division within the leadership where the organization should go. And this has brought, for example, even possibly to a more inefficient group, if you want, in the last few months. Whereas we have seen that Al-Shabaab has lost control of important ground, of important cities, of important locations where it used to dominate before.
And so your report, who's it directed against chiefly? Is it directed against the formal authorities in these countries, for example, the transitional federal government in Somalia, or is it directed against counter-terrorism officials in the UK? And what's the policy you're advocating there? Because in many ways, the logical conclusion of it is that you continue drone strikes and you continue supporting the African Union force and you continue supporting the transitional federal government. That's business as usual, yeah?
Well, it's not necessarily a research against someone. It's just really a matter of horizon scanning. So really trying to understand the trajectory, the future trajectory of the threat. So the possibility for Al-Qaeda to exploit windows of opportunity that may well emerge in volatile countries where we see now increasing instability, for example, in places like even Mali more recently, but Libya remains another concern, and obviously still Somalia and Nigeria. So it's not necessarily a paper against someone or a policy against somebody or someone. It's just really important to understand the way the threat could evolve. And at the same time, it's just a way of pointing out that it will be important for local actors to continue to unite against what might emerge as a potential element of further instability in the region, which, the presence or the establishment of Al-Qaeda core organization could well bring.
And in your report, you say that the threat is real, but it could also come back to the UK.
This is one of the many ways that the threat could impact on UK security. Obviously, it's not necessarily the first one or the most immediate one that you could think of. Obviously, as I said, that the most important, I think that the immediate consequence could be further instability in the region. But obviously, in terms of indirect threat, the way the threat could evolve is definitely a possibility for direct risk to UK security on UK soil. So there is a possibility of, first of all, fighters coming back from those localized battlegrounds and possibly coming back more indoctrinated and more committed to the cause that they were in the first place. So coming back and possibly trying to carry out attacks on UK soil. But also possibility for these people to radicalize others, to establish again the network of connections which will enable these groups to keep recruiting individuals in the West, for example, Europe and US, as has been the case recently with Al-Shabaab.
We're speaking at the time of the 100 days in the countdown to the Olympics. Surely that's going to be considered by anybody who were interested in launching a terrorist strike a kind of plum target, no?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously the Olympics still now are the main security concern for UK authorities in here. A lot and a great deal has been done to try to mitigate the risk and the threat. Obviously, it's impossible to completely eliminate it, and so we should be realistic about it. But I think that a lot has been done in terms of trying to monitor individuals of interest. For example, we know that UK authorities are aware of individuals who have traveled to Somalia, for example, to join Al-Shabaab on the ground, and so possibly coming back to the UK, or have just established connections with this group over the months. So I think that the focus will very much be on security during at Olympic times, but the threat doesn't necessarily cease and stop at the end of the Olympics.
That was Valentina Soria, a counter-terrorism expert from the Royal United Services Institute. You've been listening to On the Record, where we take you behind the headlines and tackle the issues and the people that are shaping our world. I'm James Reinl. This is the Voice of Russia in London. Stay tuned.